Hi people, it's Archivist here, and before the end of 2021, I have one last game to recommend, and that is Chorus, a game that until a few days ago I didn't know existed. I had decided to take off Christmas Eve until New Year's Day, and I needed a game to fill the time, just to enjoy this final period of the year. Went onto the Microsoft Store, looked at what I hadn't played yet, and saw Chorus and thought, you know what, I'll give this a go. I quite like arcade-style space shooters. I really enjoyed Star Wars Squadrons and the space sections of Star Wars Battlefront 2. So thought I'll enjoy it on some level at least, even if it's not quite as good as those games. But you know what? It's actually surpassed them, and this is a game I am so glad I decided to try. And I'll tell you why in this review. So beginning with the story, you play as a character called Nara. She's an ex-cult member, and she's an incredibly powerful psychic. She used to belong to a cult called the Circle, and their objective is to bring the universe under their umbrella in order to bring everlasting peace, and war will never reign again. But even though that's quite a noble goal, their means of achieving it are less than reputable, I guess you could say. And they tend to destroy those who refuse to join them, which is a little bit ironic given their goal. They're waging a lot of war and violence despite allegedly being against it. And Nora, as an incredibly powerful psychic and one of the Prophet's most trusted enforcers, I suppose, the Prophet being the leader of the Circle, of the cult, she's tasked with destroying a planet. And she carries out the order, but afterwards she's struck with a powerful epiphany. The sheer amount of loss and despair she's caused makes her realise that the cult's objectives aren't really worth the suffering they inflict to get there. So she leaves the cult and becomes a scavenger, and she's trying to, I guess, go under the radar and not get spotted as an ex-cult member. But eventually the Circle come to her and they disrupt her scavenger lifestyle that she's built with these people, these loose allies. And she decides she wants to defend them, but in order to do so, she has to reveal herself as this powerful ex-cult member, which creates some interesting tension throughout the story where you are essentially being a hero, you are fighting the cult, the enemy to the galaxy, but at the same time, you were one of their top members and you caused so much suffering yourself. So whereas some will greet you as a stranger and thank you when you help them, some will be a little bit resistant and they might not even appreciate your help because nothing can really make up for, destroying an entire planet and lots of other atrocities throughout your time there. So you're not a perfectly good hero. She's quite a flawed character, but also quite an interesting one. It's a story that is very psychologically driven. Nora is constantly trying to reconcile what she's done and trying to make it right. She's trying to change herself, and she's afraid that the powers that she possessed will bring her back to what she was, this obsessive, relentless enforcer. And helping to explore this psychological angle is actually your ship. Your ship is sentient, and it's the ship that you used when you were committing all of these atrocities, but now you've had to reclaim it in order to fight effectively against the Circle because it allows you to tap into your rights, your psychic powers. And there's a really interesting dynamic between your ship, the Forsaken, and you as Nora, where you as Nora are trying to fight the Circle because you want to just essentially protect the galaxy from them, but your ship is 100% out for revenge and just has a certain bloodlust. Like in combat, you can hear he's really enjoying it as you destroy the cult and the Circle. So I do like the back and forth, and it was really smart to make the ship sentient, I think, because even as you're flying through space between missions, you can have that constant dialogue and commentary, so Nora isn't just left on her own to introspect. Though there are elements of that where Nora will whisper to herself, which I think is just there to represent her having internal thoughts, often internal doubts. And when you combine that with the ship, it does allow for a lot of introspection on her psychology. So in terms of the concept of the story, I think it's kind of brilliant. The only thing that maybe is a little bit lackluster is you can see the, I think, limited budget maybe of this game come through here a little bit, because other than a few cutscenes where Nora is the only character in them, or maybe there's one other character who's very loosely modelled, a little bit glowy, so you can't really see the detail on them. But Nora is often one of the few people in there. Everyone else is like a portrait. So when you're flying through space, you'll be talking to them and you'll just see a still image of them talking. But you don't get a lot of cutscenes where, say, Nora is in her 3D model talking to another 3D model. So a lot of the story is just done via audio, essentially. And that's not the worst thing in the world, but it does make the story feel like something you're hearing about rather than experiencing sometimes. So in terms of the story of the game, I think it's really conceptually fascinating, and it just makes you hope maybe that if they're able to get a sequel to the game, that they can put a little bit more budget into seeing some of the cutscenes that do exist in the game but have more of the characters in them and more dynamic environments. But the reason I want to recommend this game isn't really the story anyway. It is 100% the gameplay. It is fantastic. So there's lots of dogfighting in this game where you're chasing other ships, shooting them, taking off their shields, using special psychic powers. And when you're chasing them around, in a lot of space shooters, you need to constantly re-angle yourself awkwardly to chase down all of the different fighters. But this game brings in this really awesome maneuver called the drift. And what the drift does is allow you to turn the ship, but while still preserving your original momentum. So, for example, if you have a ship chasing you, you can keep moving forward, but turn your ship around, face them and blow them up. And this works for all kinds of crazy angles and it opens up all these new options. It's really good for taking down larger ships, for example, because you can boost parallel to them, but then angle your ship so you're unleashing missile after missile. Whereas in a lot of games you would have to fly at the ship, drop your missiles, fly past it and then awkwardly turn around again. But in this, you can just keep angling the drift, so you're constantly aiming where you want to aim. And this could sound a little bit overpowered, too much of an advantage, but you've always got so many powerful enemies coming after you that it's really just balancing things out. And also on your side are those psychic powers. So one of the things you get quite early on, for example, is the ability to teleport behind enemy fighters. So that's another way that you can very easily get your sights on the enemy fighter. But not too overpowered, because whereas these smaller fighters, it's very advantageous to do that. Some where you're not really chasing them because they're a bit larger, it doesn't fulfill too much of a good purpose. So it's a situational maneuver rather than just a win button, which when I first saw it, I thought it might be, but it definitely doesn't work in every situation. You've also got the ability to throw out a lightning bolt, and this is great for taking down enemy shields and also disabling their ships so that you can take them down without them firing back at you. And they do this interesting little spin animation, and that can actually happen to you as well. You also have the ability to fire forward in this psychic spear move. This is just excellent for going through enemy ships and blowing loads of things up at once. I almost got like Super Saiyan vibes from doing this, where you just light yourself up and go forward, extremely powerful. And very late in the game, you even get the ability to use telekinesis and things, but it doesn't give you a huge amount of room to experiment with this. So I'd say the one you end up using the most is probably the teleporting behind enemies, but also the psychic bolt is very important to use because so many powerful opponents have shields and you don't want to just be wasting all of your ammo, or at least your cooldown on your weapons, trying to take them down when you can just use the storm bolt. But all of this is managed by a resource, by energy, so you can't just spam all of this. You do have to choose the right one for the right moment, otherwise you'll run out of energy for the moves you really need to use. So there's a lot to think about in combat. And on top of this, you do just have some core weapons that you can switch between. There's the Gatling gun, which is just a basic blaster, but you can upgrade it to become very powerful. There's a laser attack, which is really good for taking down enemy shields. And then there's missiles, which I found could sustain fire for a very long time, so they were really good for taking down turrets on bigger ships, or just larger opponents where their shield has been taken down. But as you can imagine from me describing all this, there is a lot to think about in combat, and it slowly introduces you to all this. It's not just thrown at you at once, so it's not too overwhelming. But I really love games that do this, where they give you so many different tools, and the tools must be used in the appropriate scenario. And it's got an almost Doom Eternal feeling to it, where in Doom Eternal you also have this massive armory of guns and weapons and abilities, and different opponents demand different uses of them. And this is almost like the space shooter version of that, and it's really fun. Like every engagement, your brain is firing with all the possibilities of what you can fire. And to be fair, sometimes when things get really hectic, I'm even just pulling or pushing any button I can because I'm starting to get a bit overwhelmed with things, but it's always fun, it's always enjoyable, and it's key to never stop moving, because if you just stand still, which you can do in this ship, you can literally just be a complete halt. But if you do that, you will get blown up very quickly by the enemies in this game. I'd say that on the regular difficulty, it's actually a decent, well-calibrated challenge. But if you keep moving and you stay evasive, then you can definitely avoid dying too much, I would say. Unless, like me, you get a little bit too ambitious with the drift, you spin yourself around and you don't see the asteroid that you just crashed into before it's too late, right? But yeah, again, the drift, like I really can't overemphasize, guys, how cool this is. It's hard to describe it because it's a very simple thing. You shift the ship without changing your forward momentum. That is it. That is all you do. But the possibilities it opens up and the feeling of doing it, it is so immensely satisfying, and it looks really cool as well. So this drift, I think we're going to see it in more games, because as cool as the psychic powers are, like you'd think that's the big thing about this game. That's why it's so fun. But no, the drift. The drift is absolutely phenomenal. I loved it so much, and it really takes advantage of the space setting, because it's not something you could really do, you know, in an in-atmosphere jet fighter, I guess, because it wouldn't make any physical sense, but it kind of makes sense in a sci-fi sense here. So I really enjoyed the gameplay, really fun, and also just looks phenomenal. I think it really has a great visual style to it as you're blowing up the fighters and then you fly through the flames. It's really cool like that. And yeah, as I was talking about before, as you're blowing up opponents, you get Nora and your ship talking as they destroy them. So there's almost like a sense that you're a shark eating all the little fish because you're just hunting them all down. It's really fun, guys. Like my words can't do it justice. I just hope the gameplay does. And, you know, this is just me playing. You might be able to get way more refined than I ever could. It is so much fun. And the only thing I will say is, I would be happy just doing this constantly in this game, the fighting. It is just so fun. But there were definitely gaps as I was playing, long stretches throughout the story where you're not really fighting much. Like, it might send you down these puzzle sections or just traversing the galaxy, but nothing is as fun as the combat, and there were definitely some periods where I felt like the combat had gone away for just a bit too long. Like, I can appreciate that they're trying to mix it up with the puzzle stuff or the narrative stuff, but when your combat is this good, you don't want to hold back. You want to embrace just how fun it is. So that's one thing I might say, is I wish there were more fights than there are. Not to say there aren't a lot of fights, but I wish it was more densely populated throughout the game. And then we come to the visuals, and I just have no complaints here. It looks great, it runs great, just nothing I can complain about. Looks really good. The design of the ship, your main ship, is phenomenal. Like I said earlier though, maybe the fact that when characters are talking it's always relying on the 2D portraits, or almost always, takes away a little bit from the believability, but in terms of how space in this game looks, it really is very eye-catching. And I suppose they could have made it easy for themselves and just had you going through deep space and not really had to have put anything in the game. But no, the different sectors you go to, and that's something I haven't really mentioned, by the way. This is almost semi-open world where you have these large open areas you can go around and even do side missions on, because it's not an entirely linear game. There's like the main story missions, but there's also side missions. So yeah, as you're going through these different areas, they do look quite distinct. Like, one will have like a cityplex going on, interestingly, in space. One will be giant ice shards. One will be more a traditional asteroid field. So there's a surprising amount of variety for a game set in space. I really liked it. So yeah, this game, Chorus, I am so glad I tried it. And once again, like, my words cannot do it justice in terms of gameplay. I guess I should mention, I did have a crash when I played, just one. But it did make me go back much further than I thought it would. I swore the game should have been auto-saving, but it didn't. But other than that, which was a bit unfortunate, I really love playing this game, and I seriously would recommend giving it a try. Like, Chorus, it's a lot of fun, even if you don't usually try this sort of thing, honestly, because it just feels that good to play. And also, I don't believe it's full price. I think I paid maybe £32 for it on the Microsoft Store, so it's not a full price game either, so lower barrier to entry. I assume that's the same across other platforms. So As always, people, thanks very much for watching and see you next time.